Are you the partner, family member, or friend of an autistic person, and you find that communication often gets misinterpreted? Or maybe you are autistic, and you find that however hard you try, communication with loved ones often misses, like you are somehow talking a different language, even though all the words are the same. Maybe the unspoken cues that other people seem to do effortlessly in relationships just don't work the same way. Well, you're not alone. Autistic people do communicate slightly differently, so let's chat about how that might manifest, the reasons why, and look at ways we might be able to make communication with those who are the closest to us go a bit smoother. Hi, I'm Phil, a late diagnosed autistic older adult, and it's my goal to advocate for autistic people by providing positive information about autism and sharing a few of my own experiences along the way. Okay, so the first point I want to make here is that when it comes to autistic communication challenges in relationships, that it's not your fault or theirs. Autistic people do in fact communicate differently to neurotypical people, so sometimes there will also be miscommunication. Another really important point here is that these times of miscommunication are in no way caused by a lack of care or love on behalf of the autistic person. And often from the autistic perspective, it feels like we still get it wrong, no matter how hard we try. So let's cut straight to the chase at this point. Autistic people have a different brain. By this, I mean that before any human is born, their brain is formed in the womb. This is when the fundamental wiring happens, and by that I mean it's when the neural structure is created and starts to develop. It's in this part of the brain's development that in some people extra neural pathways are formed, and some common pathways might be developed differently or even be missing. And it's during this developmental period where our neural profile is set. For most, this will be neurotypical in that most of the common neural pathways will be similar to the wider population. But for others, the small differences will mean our brain is a bit different, or in other words, neurodivergent. This might lead to the brain structure and thus the processing being consistent with autism, ADHD, Tourette syndrome, or any one of many neurodivergences. And this is what we mean by the term neurodiversity. In essence, neurodiversity does not just cover autistic, ADHD, or indeed just neurodivergence, but rather refers to the diversity of brains across all people, including neurotypical. And here is where the term becomes really relevant to communication in relationships between autistic and non-autistic people. These relationships are what we would call neurodiverse relationships, or in other words, relationships between people with brains that work in different ways. So going back to communication, it's because our brains are wired differently at a fundamental level that we communicate in subtly different ways. This difference is sometimes referred to as the double empathy problem. First coined by autistic sociologist Damien Milton, double empathy describes how autistic and non-autistic people communicate differently, and that autistic people actually have well-developed communication that can function exceptionally well between autistic people, but can break down across neurotypes. Neither group is actually responsible for the miscommunication that follows, but it is often the autistic person that gets the blame, largely because the autistic group is the minority, coupled with negative stereotypes that are prevalent in society that wrongly characterise autism. One aspect of autistic thinking is a strong tendency towards rigid patterns of behaviour, including how we think. This might impact communication in several ways, but a few examples here might include getting upset if plans change. The amount of planning and preparation that autistic people put into any outing or social gathering can be quite extensive to compensate for our limitations in social communication. So once we set our minds on something and start doing the mental preparation toward that, we might get stuck on it. And when plans change, that can cause a level of distress. We may also have set routines around home or in life in general. And likewise, if these are messed with, the autistic person can also become distressed. These and other examples of rigidity can cause tension in relationships if the reasons are not understood by the non-autistic partner. There might be a temptation to think that these examples seem quite trivial, so why can't the autistic person just adapt like everyone else? But the reality is that this rigidity is not a choice, but a fundamental part of how our brain works. The autistic person might also create rules as to how things are done. For example, loading the dishwasher for an autistic person might come with self-imposed rules as to how it should be done. This might cause friction if we either communicate that in a blunt or tactless way to other family members, or we might not communicate what our rules or routines might be, and then get frustrated when the other person continues to do it the wrong way, leading to frustration that might be observed by our family members without knowing where the root cause of this frustration lies. This type of miscommunication can thus cause friction in our relationships. Another aspect of communication in relationships that may cause some issues is the fact that autistic people have a strong tendency towards literal thinking and interpretations. Where this might cause tension is when someone says one thing and does something slightly different. A trivial example here might be saying you'll meet the autistic person at a specific time, but then being 5 or 10 minutes late. For many people, this flexibility with time might be considered a part of normal interpersonal transactions and no big deal. For the autistic person, even this small variation to the meeting agreement can feel like being let down or even trigger anxiety. But all autistic people are different, and some might either be okay with this or even be the ones that are often late. Another variation on this is expecting the autistic person to intuitively understand unspoken messages. In many relationships, unspoken communication is a natural and indeed important transaction. Now, many autistic people might be able to successfully navigate some level of unspoken communication, especially in intimate relationships. But even the autistic people who might usually do this well may sometimes find these unspoken messages are either not received or misjudged in some way. So to be sure, and especially for issues that really matter, it might be best to reinforce unspoken messages with clear, unambiguous verbal communication. Another common experience of autistic people is what's called rejection sensitivity dysphoria. This means the autistic person is likely to take comments to heart and perceive them as judgment or rejection. These feelings of rejection can be triggered by comments that might appear quite benign to a non-autistic person. Likewise, any form of criticism, even if intended as positive or constructive, might be devastating to the autistic person. Now, this does not mean that the autistic person is oversensitive or should not be critiqued or guided, but any guidance should be carefully framed and not given in an unconsidered or ad hoc manner. Sometimes it may even be that positive comments trigger this same type of rejection. Rejection sensitivity can lead to other issues in relationships, including overreacting to perceived rejection, avoidance, conflict, or even ending the relationship. Another common autistic trait, and one that non-autistic people might find difficult to understand, is demand avoidance. Sometimes also referred to as pathological demand avoidance or PDA, demand avoidance is extremely common in autistic people. How this might manifest is when asking an autistic person to do something, they might resist in what seems to be an illogical way. This does not need to be anything significant, but might be something as simple as asking the autistic person to do the dishes. In our mind, we might have seen the dishes needed doing and have been just about to do them, but as soon as we are asked to do it, an invisible barrier comes up, making it hard for us to follow through. Internally, there is a resistance to any demands being placed upon us. This can lead to the autistic person responding to any request with the word no, and this can quickly become problematic in any relationship. This is one that I've had to work on personally, as it was causing some tension in my relationship with Trish, as I would reactively respond with the word no, even if I would then go and do whatever it was that was being requested. In me, it got to the point where I was also responding with no to any comment, which was understandably very challenging for Trish, potentially triggering rejection sensitivity in her also. Demand avoidance can also be related to the autistic person needing a strong sense of autonomy or agency in the decisions relating to ourselves. Thus, PDA can also be referred to as a persistent desire for autonomy in the autistic person. Autistic people may also have a different way of expressing love language, which can also be present in the ways we communicate. A very common autistic trait in this area is infodumping. This is where we unload volumes of information on people close to us on topics of special interest. This can often be done with little appreciation of the level of mutual interest from the recipient for the information being shared. It seems a little odd to think about this as a love language, but the people we are most likely to infodump with are those closest to us. And yes, this might cause annoyance when inevitably this happens at the end of the day and the recipient is tired and unreceptive. For me, this can happen as I infodump to Trish at bedtime when she is least able to appreciate it. This is just one possible area of autistic love language, and each autistic person will likely have different ways they express this. Some other examples might be parallel play, where we spend time together but doing different activities, or penguin pebbling, which might include offering small consistent acts of attention or sharing small acts of kindness. Regardless of what our love languages might be, our expectations of love languages might be different between autistic and neurotypical partners, so that needs to be worked out together in any relationship. Autistic people often have difficulties in recognising, understanding or describing our emotions. This is called alexithymia. In relationships, this difficulty in knowing how to express our emotions can lead to tension or even dislocation, especially when a partner may ask how we are feeling and we may not be able to answer. It may also be that the autistic person does not even understand how sensations in the body relate to emotions. All this may mean the autistic person does not know how to feel or express love in a way that a neurotypical partner might understand. And this may cause relationship tension and potentially lead to feelings of rejection in the non-autistic partner. To be clear here, it is not that autistic people can't experience love. It might just be that we experience it in a different way. And of course, as we've stated so many times before, many autistic people also have ADHD, which adds another layer of complexity to how we communicate in relationships. Challenges with executive functioning might mean we struggle with planning or executing tasks, leading to tension when things get missed. ADHD can also complicate our emotional regulation, leading to things like emotional flooding, where intense emotions overwhelm the nervous system, leading to fight, flight, or freeze. Autistic people may reach a state of overwhelm quicker than non-autistic people. At this point, we might disconnect from the communication. It can also cause us to shut down entirely. In these circumstances, we might even temporarily be unable to speak as the overwhelm of the intensity of a situation floods our nervous system. And this situational mutism is something that I have experienced myself during intense interactions like this. Autistic people often experience a range of sensory challenges. This is very important to understand if you are in a relationship with an autistic person. When we experience sensory overwhelm in any of our senses, we might experience shutdowns or even meltdowns. These sudden changes in the autistic person can easily be misinterpreted by a partner or loved one as anger, dismissal, or rejection, when it might purely be sensory in nature. Touch is another important aspect of any relationship, but an autistic person may be overwhelmed by touch and even pull back from touch, leading to feelings of rejection in the non-autistic partner. As autistic people, we need to be aware of how our reactions might be perceived and help our partners understand that these reactions are not a rejection of them, and thus work together to understand what is pleasurable and what leads to discomfort. For me, I find light touch uncomfortable. So if I'm sitting on the couch with Trish watching TV and her leg brushes against mine, I might instinctively pull away in that moment, which could be perceived as rejection. Now, at this point, I want to diverge slightly and talk about meltdowns and how they can be perceived in relationships. Many autistic people experience meltdowns either as a response to sensory or emotional overwhelm, or even as a response to general overwhelm or fatigue. Meltdowns can be challenging for our non-autistic partners to witness, and depending on what physical attributes our meltdowns include, might even be perceived as threatening to our partners. Now, to be clear here, any form of either physical or verbal abuse of our partners during autistic meltdown is unacceptable. If this is happening, then appropriate interventions may be required. No partner of an autistic person should feel they need to accept living in a dangerous relationship to support their autistic partner. But I won't say any more here, as I am neither qualified to do so or have any experience in these types of situations. What I am experienced with, however, is how I personally melt down, and how that can include breaking things or even self-harming. And I know these things are very challenging for Trish to witness, and I am all too aware that any observer could perceive these situations as threatening, which is a challenge I have to manage to make sure I don't inadvertently cause anyone else to feel threatened. Now, while meltdowns are not a planned outburst and are unavoidable in those moments of extreme nervous system overwhelm, there is a certain level of control that can be exercised. It's this control or limited ability to suppress the outcome of the meltdown that can be exercised to make sure we do not cause harm to others, be that physical or psychological. But also be aware that the meltdown will happen despite the efforts to suppress it. So as a partner of an autistic person, understanding that single fact may be helpful. And for more on meltdowns, please refer to my podcast on that topic. Autistic people are often very sensitive to patterns, both in the world around us and in people. So despite the fact that we may have issues with some communication, we may also be very perceptive to what might be happening in the people closest to us. The problem that may occur here is when other people lack that same level of perception. The autistic person might be gaslit when picking up on these things that no one else can see, and thus no one else believes the autistic observations. This can cause a level of trauma, especially if this becomes a pattern in communication with the people closest to the autistic person. So what things might help when communicating with your autistic loved one? Be specific in all communication. Don't assume the autistic person has caught any subtext. If you say something important, make sure that the meaning can be interpreted literally. A saying that is well used in the autistic community is say what you mean and mean what you say. Now, obviously, we need to communicate with all people, autistic or neurotypical, appropriately to their level of intelligence, and not communicate with an autistic person simplistically just because they are autistic. And you may need to adjust expectations around what love is and how it might be expressed in an intimate relationship with an autistic person. Now, all this might seem to suggest that having any type of relationship, but in particular an intimate relationship with an autistic person, might be too hard or too complicated. This is definitely not the message I want to send. In fact, when the communication differences are understood by both parties, autistic people do actually make for great friends and partners. If you are already in a relationship with an autistic person, you have probably recognised their good qualities, and it's very likely that some of those might be because of their autism. Autistic people are often very loyal and have strong personal values, which are great assets in any relationship. Okay, I'm sure there is a lot more we could talk about here, but maybe we can come back to that with a part 2 down the track. And I know some of you have requested that I do a podcast with Trish talking about the challenges and indeed the positives of being in relationship with this autistic person. I'll keep working on that possibility. In the meantime, please feel free to share your experiences of autistic communication in relationships in the comments. And I appreciate that for some, this might be a challenging or even triggering topic, so please take care in how sharing might impact you personally. So until next time, bye for now.